In this edition of Loser Donald, we're going to talk about two of the explanations that Trump has been giving over the past few months about why his supporters shouldn't be worried about his chances come next Tuesday, even though the polls, which have been tightening to some extent since last week, show him losing in enough states to give Hillary Clinton the presidency. The first of those explanations, which is simply by making it an admission of how much of a loser you are, is that there are shy Trump voters. That there's a certain percentage of his base of support that is out there that likes him and wants him to be president, and yet is so... They acknowledge the fact that to admit to like this clear bigot, this sexist, this racist, is a bad thing. And so there's a social desirability to pretending that you're not a fan of him. And so the belief is that even if the polls show that Hillary Clinton is up, or the gap is 3 points or 5 points or 7 points, come election day, when people aren't having to admit that they like Trump to an individual, and instead can simply cast a vote, that he will have more support. The problem with that theory is that you can actually test for it, and there are ways to figure out if people are simply avoiding admitting that they like a candidate because of social desirability. And the way that they do that is you compare polls that are done with an actual individual, a human asking you who you plan to vote for, versus online polls where it's anonymous. You're not admitting to any individual. It is simply a field on an online poll. And they found that there is only the very slightest effect between those two. The online non-personal polls tend to show something like 1 point of gain for Donald Trump over the polls where you have to actually admit to a person what is going on. And so that's possible that there is something like 1 point of shy voters, which is, of course, not enough to sway any individual state or certainly the election towards him. It's also entirely possible that that's simply a variation that comes up randomly, and if you were to run this experiment hundreds of times, you might find the same thing towards Hillary Clinton, for instance. So, not impossible, it was a good theory to put forward, but the only evidence we have indicates that it is an entirely minimal effect that is unlikely to actually sway the election, and is indeed likely to be drowned out by any number of other things that we can't currently test for. For instance, the idea that there could be a huge difference between the various campaigns' ground games and day of operations in terms of being able to make phone calls, bring people to the polls, and things of that sort. Those sorts of effects almost certainly larger than the non-existent shy voters. But let's briefly stop before moving on to acknowledge that his argument that he's made in any number of speeches is, I know that my supporters are embarrassed to admit that they actually like me, and that's why I'll win. You're in a pretty bad position when that's the best argument that you have, that you're still in this thing. So there's the shy voters. It's been tested for. It doesn't actually exist. Now, there is one other explanation that I think actually had something to it prior to the test. And the idea was there that, if you recall, back during the primaries, a lot more people voted in the Republican primary in 2016 than they did in previous Republican primaries. And the idea there is Donald Trump is bringing in tons of new voters who are not normally political. They have not been involved in these sorts of elections before, and those people now, when it comes to the general election, are going to be a huge base of support for him that polls might be missing because they're assuming that the electorate is going to look much like it did back in 2012. So Donald Trump has been talking about this, his campaign has been talking about this since back in the primaries, and it's actually a compelling argument. However, it's also one that we have some evidence on, and it indicates that he might not be right, although there's certainly more to it than the shy voters. And so the idea there is that these people were getting involved in the primary because of Donald Trump. But the thing is, polls looked into that, and they found throughout the primaries that what was not going on was that these people had never voted before and were suddenly getting involved. What was going on is they didn't generally get engaged in Republican primaries. Instead, they'd stay home during the primaries and then reliably vote Republican during the general elections. That's what they were doing. They weren't such partisans that they got involved in the primaries, which few people admittedly do, but they still vote for Republicans. And so if he's expecting that there's millions and millions of new voters that have come into the process only because of him that are going to sway the general election, there's not a lot of evidence that that's actually the case. More likely, the regular sort of Republican support will be there for him. Although we also know from polls that he's drawing a lower percentage of the Republican vote than is typically the case for the Republican nominee, whereas Hillary Clinton is drawing much the same of the Democratic vote as prior Democratic nominees. Again, this is not my preference. This isn't like my opinion here. These are the polls. This is the evidence, the actual information that we have. Now, let's talk about some other things that could be influencing this. So I mentioned a little bit earlier on that we still don't know how big of an effect the different candidates' ground games will be. We know that Hillary Clinton has way more field offices for her campaign in various states, in some cases 100 times as many offices as Donald Trump does. We know that she has far more employees. Now, I would not be surprised to find out that Donald Trump might have more volunteers on Election Day. We know that his supporters tend to be much more fired up to support him than Hillary Clinton's supporters are for her. And I don't know that anyone has actually measured that. It could be that in place of actual campaign employees, he will simply field an army of enthusiastic volunteers on Election Day who can make a lot of phone calls, who can drive a lot of people to the polls. That might end up being significant. And I don't know that anyone has actually looked into it in a systematic way. I don't know that that data is actually there. If I were Donald Trump, I would be making that case, even without any evidence existing for it, because the idea that you have so many passionate followers who will win the election for you is a much more convincing case than you have so many people who are embarrassed of looking like racists and Islamophobes that they won't actually admit on polls that they like you. I would switch up the messaging and go in that direction. Now, there's a couple of other things that could be the case. I mean, there's several states that right now look like they're almost exactly 50-50. Florida is the biggest example of this. I believe 538 did 10,000 simulations of the election, and Hillary and Trump split Florida exactly 5,000 to 5,000. Now, any sort of advantage that a particular campaign can get in Florida could be decisive. That's actually perhaps the only case in which the shy voters could be enough theoretically. I still think it's likely to be swamped out by other effects. But 1% in Florida right now is significant. It's a hard case to make, and I understand the difficult position that he's in, is that he's not had much good polling for a very long time. It was back during the primaries that he was able to reliably talk about how he was leading in all the polls. That hasn't really been the case in quite a while. And especially when you consider how many people have already voted. And I know that this isn't directly related, but I do want to talk about this a little bit. There is analysis going on of early voting in a number of states, and there are certainly states where Republicans are doing better in 2016 than they were in 2012. I believe that Arizona is an example of that. But there's also states like Ohio, like Nevada, where the Democrats are doing better than they previously were. All of these little effects could be the thing that sways the election. Anything that changes Florida by 2 or 3 points, that's your election right there. If Nevada does actually go for Hillary Clinton, that's probably your election right there. A lot of analyses say that Donald Trump has at best a 9% chance of winning the election if he doesn't win Nevada. And currently, by the early voting, it looks like Democrats are doing as well as they did in the previous presidential election. Anyway, we're going to be going much more in depth on the post-game show of tomorrow on the Young Turks, looking at the current state of the polls, trying to get an idea of how this election might shake out. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, a little bit excited and talking about it right now. But anyway, that's Loser Donald for the day. If you hear this talk about shy Trump voters, understand that it amounts to about 1% of a change in the current experiments right now. Don't believe the hype about the shy voters. And also the idea that he's brought tons of new people into the election, also not backed up by the evidence. I understand people prefer to dwell in emotion and opinion, but we do actually have facts on a lot of this stuff. Let's actually look towards it when we can. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I'll see you in the next one.